I'm really excited this morning to welcome Andrew Cooper from EVORA EDGE, who is going to now do his talk about net zero carbon strategies for property.
Thank you very much. I shall assume your former position. Awesome. I've got a clicker. Hopefully it'll work, but we've got a little video, which is probably the quickest way to explain what we do. But just really to build on what Vicky said about why we set up this centre. It was in the middle of COVID, and everyone was shutting offices and closing spaces, and this floor and upstairs used to be the regional HQ for a very well known firm of engineers and environmental consultants called WSP. And my business partner said, Andrew, the space is available, what should we do? I said, take it. We'll expand, we'll do this thing called an innovation hub, and it came on to become a knowledge hub. So we wanted to begin conversations with the local authority and to continue to develop our relationship with the university, as we'd held conversations with them about indoor air quality, which of course with COVID was extremely important. But say the rest of the say is history. So I'm going to give that a next, and I believe we can play the video. Thank you. We call that the Edge Shuffle, that little dance. There we go. Right, we're going to talk today about net zero carbon strategies, and it is a workshop, so I didn't just want to come up and read everyone a lecture. And we reached out to the people in this room, the people online, and also to some of our clients about what their challenges were and what did they want to know, or what might they want to know from a workshop in respect to the net zero carbon agenda and so their day-to-day challenges through work. And I've been sent 8 big questions, as I've called them. So we're going to talk about EPCs. I think it's very difficult to not discuss net zero carbon and EPCs in the same conversation, which is a controversial subject, I think, because real energy and real net zero carbon and EPCs are not necessarily the same thing. But the reality is they are important, and we're going to have a look at why. Gas, well, we all know gas has gone up an awful lot in price for various reasons, and we'll probably need to have a bit think about what that looks like for buildings. When is it going to be phased out? Timetable, we're going to talk about the proposed changes to something called minimum energy efficiency standards, or MEES as we just call it. One of the questions, should I run an EPC as my first step to asset management, I think was the context of that question. PVs, I've been asked about PVs, are they worthwhile in offices, but we can extend that to any building, I guess. Something called Neighbours, it's not a TV series, it's being phased out, but we'll talk about that, and what does that mean, and will it replace EPCs, that was the question. Payback exemption, again, I think that's in the context of MEES, that question I was asked. And the business case for decarbonisation. So what does that look like? So at the bottom, obviously, there's a picture of yours truly. And the only reason it's there is because I'm going to talk about Neighbours. And EVORA EDGE, along with many much larger practices, I might add, is a delivery partner for neighbours with or through an association called the Better Buildings Partnership, and an initiative that they've introduced to the UK called the Design for Performance Initiative. So we'll have a look at all of that. If I've got time at the end, I probably won't, but if I do, there's a bit of a space filler. I was going to show you what an EPC looks like, because it's very easy to talk about things in the abstract, but actually a lot of work can go into them, and they can be really useful tools, and I thought maybe I'd actually show you one in the flesh. So huge things. So EPCs, I'll quickly dwell on what they are. So before you can rent or before you can sell a building, and I'm talking, today's talk is really about commercial property, but it applies also to domestic. Before you can rent or before you can sell a building, you must have one. And that's under a directive, the European Buildings, EU Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which has been transposed into UK law. And there's another separate piece of regulations called the Private Rented Sector Regulations, or MEES as we call it, that says if you've got an EPC, then you have to have a minimum rating before you can let it. And that's caused, it's caused some interesting conversations with clients, particularly if you're a fund client or Shropshire, a local authority, for example, where you might have a large estate. You know, that's an issue. So you need to understand where you've got risks, where you might not be able to rent your building, and what you have to do in order to achieve that. And we'll talk about that throughout the course of today. But the reason I've told you all this is there changes afoot, and really profound change. So sat behind these EPC calculations is a carbon conversion factor. So an EPC is a measurement of predicted carbon. And they've been very, very out of date. They sort of dated to around 2011 under something called SAP 2012. So I think they ran their calculations in 2011. And what we can see from this slide is that the carbon factor, so 1 kilowatt hour of energy, so 1 kilowatt hour of electricity and 1 kilowatt hour of gas times a carbon conversion factor equals what we call your built emissions rate. And we can see the huge drop between electricity and between in 2012 and something called SAP 10.2, which comes into effect the 1st of June. So in June, these emissions factors will become law. And therefore, in the world of EPCs, if you've got electricity in buildings, that's going to be good. And if you don't, that's going to be not so good. So it could change your EPC rating overnight if you were going to have the same assessment the next day. So that's again caused some very interesting conversations with clients who are wanting to fast forward certain works to bank, if you like, a good EPC rating, to give them some space to think about what the regulations, the MEES regulations, mean. So currently under MEES, the benchmark is an E, so if you've got an F or G rated asset, you might not be able to rent it. So people say you won't be able to rent it. That's not true. You might not be able to rent it. You have to go through a process. But government is proposing to change that, and we'll talk about that in some forward slides. So first I want to sort of dwell on the subject of gas. So we can already see that electricity is going to become more favourable in the world of EPCs, in the world of MEES, and these are important tools in the government's armoury to deliver net zero carbon. But also the government has made no secret that it is looking to phase out gas. And these are just really some of the deadlines for that. But I had to look this one up actually. So the Heat and Building Strategy, which was published in 2021, is talking about phasing out all gas boilers by 2035. But the Climate Change Committee would prefer to see it sooner. And so I think what we can take from this slide, without reading every word, is that gas is going to become increasingly unfavourable in terms of decarbonisation through real carbon, through EPCs, but also, as we're seeing, through cost. So some of our clients have faced overnight 300% plus increases in their gas bills, and that's having a serious impact in terms of their service charge recovery and all sorts of things. I won't dwell too much on this. If I say this is a sort of the landscape of regulations at the moment. So under MEES, we're talking now specifically about MEES. If you have an EPC, as of today, if you've got an F4G, then it's a bit tricky to let that property. You need to demonstrate that there's nothing you can do that's economically viable. There's some other get out of jail clauses, and then and only then can you go ahead and let that. But in reality, what we're finding is in the marketplace, people don't want Fs or Gs, and in fact, many people don't even want Es, certainly at the corporate level. By the 1st of April 2023, they're extending the regulations to say you must not continue to let if it's got an EPC and an F4G. So continue to, if you've got one. If you don't have an EPC, not a problem. MEES doesn't apply. And that creates an enormous amount of confusion in the market. So we've been talking to some local authorities about assets that they're worried about because they felt they had to have an EPC prepared by this. I said, no, don't do that. Because if you do that, MEES will apply. You can have an indicative one, see what it looks like, and then have a think. But the moment you've lodged it, you're introducing the MEES regulations. So that's where we are today. Likely obligations in a plethora of government consultation documents and papers is that by 2030, the E will become a B. And I think that's accepted in the industry, almost without any doubt. This is where we're going. Potential obligations. As I said earlier, EPCs in the real world are not the same. And there are other better mechanisms, in my view, to manage energy and to manage carbon. And government has been told this time and time and time again. And one of their consultation documents is looking at just this. So they are looking to introduce mandatory operational energy ratings for buildings over 1,000 metres squared. And that's late in their decision. It was expected last autumn. And they're talking about a hybrid approach from 2030. So they're saying we would introduce this requirement for operational energy ratings much sooner, 2022, 2023. But from 2030, we would prefer to see what they call a hybrid approach. And essentially, if you've got a building that's over 1,000 square metres, you'd have to have one of these certificates. And they've talked about various rating schemes in the paper, display energy certificates, neighbours that I mentioned before, and another, I'm afraid I forget what the other one is. But I think the slides will be circulated, so all these links will take you to the relevant papers. We've put this under potential, but I think actually I've changed my mind. I think it's probably likely. From the 1st of April 2027, they're talking about an interim milestone of a C, which makes sense, because you don't just want to say, on 2030 it's a B. So there's sort of a pathway to get you to a C. So for many of our clients, that's what we're going for now. We're going for the C now, we're banking it, and then we're having a think, how can I get to a B? So yeah, well, this was an easy one for me to answer. Should I run my EPCs as a first step? And I think this is in the context of understanding your MEES risk. Of course, you should do that, because otherwise it's just me taking a guess. Yes, I think if you do this, you might get a C or a B. Get a model built, run through some scenarios, look at the costs, look at the practicalities of what it is that you want to do. So we would never advocate that you just rip stuff out and put stuff in. We would suggest you look at the wider picture of how the real estate industry works around cost recovery, dilapidations, lease events and so forth. But before that, get a model. And run the scenarios through that, and retain that model throughout the life of the building. You can transfer them. So we tend to use only 3 or 4 pieces of software that most of the industry uses. So I can send my model to someone else. They can ask it questions, run scenarios, send it back, and we can have a conversation using these models. So I don't really see them as EPC models. I see them as asset management tools. And I don't want to get too techy, but there's 2 types of, for commercial world, 2 types of software, or 2 types of simulation rather. One called SBEM, which is an acronym for Simplified Building Energy Model. The clue is in the title. And one is a more complex version called DSM. Your choice of which one would to use would be down to the cost, how much you're willing to pay, but the complexity of the asset. Certainly in 90% of our work, we don't use SBEM, but we would always use DSM because actually as an engineer, I'd like to ask the model some other questions that I can't ask in SBEM. So have a think about the type of model you're going to pay for. Next question, is PV worthwhile? Yes, short answer, I could move on for that, but again, a bit like gas, electricity's gone up roughly about 20%. So gas has gone up 300%, electricity 20%. So it's just made them even more viable, but you've got to be quite practical in their application. So what we have seen and stopped, if we've had the chance, is where people just carpet their roofs with PV. So have a think about what else you need to use that roof for. So if you've got an office building, for example, and you want to transition through a net zero carbon strategy from gas to something else, unless you intend to empty your entire building out, you might need a bit of space to have two types of plant for a period while you phase from plant A to system B. So have a think about what your 5 to 10 year strategy is for that building before you sacrifice your roof to PV. But I mean, PV as an investment is cracking. The yields are amazing. I've got 6+++++, because by the time you factor in energy price inflation, you can get 10-12% easily on PV systems, which far exceeds the internal rate of return probably of the property as an investment in itself. So that was an easy one. Neighbours, right. What I talked a minute ago about the 1,000 square metre rule, which is to apply to most commercial properties. It's a slightly misleading statement if you actually look at the government calls the consultation introducing performance-based ratings in commercial and industrial offices. I don't really know what an industrial office is. I know what an industrial building is, and I know what an office building is, and I know some industrial buildings have offices. So I think there's a typo in their consultation document, because when you go into it, it's quite clear that they mean the full thing. So Neighbours has been introduced to the UK by the Better Buildings Partnership. Now the Better Buildings Partnership is a collaboration of some of the largest real estate companies in the UK. The value of assets under their management, I think, is 240 billion. So they're very influential. If you've got a pension, and if the pension has real estate, probably that pension is a member of the BBP. And they're very much there to be a voice for sustainability for the industry. And they have brought Neighbours to the UK. So Neighbours is Australian. It's an acronym for the, I'll try and get this right, the National Australian Building Energy Rating System. And it's been fantastically successful in Australia. It's been pushed by Australian government. And basically it says it's a star rating, 1 to 6, and such is the success of Neighbours in Australia that it affects the rent. So when you're going to rent a property, if you're a bank or government or whatever, you'll say, I expect to see a certain Neighbours rating, and if I don't get it, I'm going to pay you less rent. And that's had a massive impact. And it's ironic, because if you go, I mean, I love Australia, I'm married to an Australian. If you go there, their environmental credentials are appalling. They're digging up their entire backyard. I mean, their Prime Minister was waving coal in their equivalent of Parliament not that long ago, saying coal is good. So they've got all that terrible stuff going on, but they've got this amazing rating system. And we said, well, we'll have it here. And it's been introduced, and the government, BEIS, has referenced it in a couple of papers. And certainly I think we could expect to see it playing an important role in part of the office landscape. But Neighbours in Australia covers the full spectrum of property type. But at the moment we're just looking at offices and what we call the landlord's rating. So we're just looking at systems the landlord can control. But it's definitely worth familiarising yourself with what that could mean. And there are other schemes, so the scheme I couldn't remember, BREEAM in use, Neighbours and DEX. I think that's probably the essence of that slide. Next question, please. Why am I so suspicious of EPCs? Da-da. So this was produced by the BBP again, and it's a really interesting slide because here is a bunch of EPCs from A right through to G, and what we've got is their real energy consumption versus their EPC rating. And what I can see from here is my E-rated buildings are not too dissimilar to my Cs and even my Bs. And look, I've even got some Fs and Gs doing better than A's. So I could put in the most efficient LED bulb available, but if I leave it on 24/7, I'm going to be consuming more energy than a 100-watt light bulb I've left on for 10 minutes. So it's not just about the intrinsic efficacy of your asset, but actually it's about how you use it. And I think this is why, sensibly, government is now looking to have this hybrid approach between an asset rating and an operational rating for the larger buildings, which consume significant amounts of energy in the UK. So payback, I was asked, yes, about do we have to implement these recommendations through the recommendations reports, or just to comply with MEES? Are there exemptions? And this is just really building on what I've already said. You can let a G-rated building today, but you've got to demonstrate that there's nothing you can do that's economically viable. And there's a formula in the regulations, and basically it's got to pay for itself within 7 years. And if it doesn't pay for itself within 7 years, you don't have to do it. And you simply go onto the PRS register and say, here's my evidence, and for the moment I can carry on letting as an F or as a G. But you'll have to go through that process at least once every 5 years. So you've now introduced an administrative burden, if you like, around that. And there are other get-out-of-jail cards. Devaluation. If an independent surveyor states that making the energy efficiency improvements would reduce the property's value by more than 5%, you don't have to do it. I struggle to think of many examples where that might be the case. Potentially listed buildings where you wouldn't want to put you wouldn't want to put in some systems in listed buildings. You might lose some floor space or whatever. I think far and few between. Right. Payback exemption, that's a continuation of my previous slide. So in summing up, there is an exemption for works that are not cost effective today. And there's likely to remain a payback exemption in 2027 and 2030. I think that's the important point there. That when we go to a C, probably, and a B, probably, it still doesn't mean you can't let your building. The exception to the rule might be this introduction of the hybrid approach. So, as I've explained, you can let it today, but in 2030, you might not be able to let it without, if you can't get your B, you might then have to, you'd only be able to let it if you then have this annual operational rating. So, for large buildings over 1,000 square metres, this 5-year max exemption might not apply. That's just me reading the rules. Hopefully that makes sense, but I'm happy to answer questions on that afterwards. So I did some, so carbonomics and economics. I use the word carbonomics just because I like it, but it's the economics of carbon. And this is a case study that I ran for a client because there's always been a disconnect between the business case for decarbonisation and the amount you pay for kilowatt hours. And it's been expensive to decarbonise. Heat pumps are expensive, boilers typically are cheap. So I ran some numbers with the new emissions factors that we've talked about, and also using some actual energy prices that this particular client pays. And I'm going to come around this side because I can see it better, sorry. But what we've got here is it's a real building, this, and we've got a boiler, and I'm asking the question, should we move to a heat pump? Green is good. So what we can see is that in 2021, before the energy prices, the boiler was cheaper to run. But in 2022, with the new price they're paying over here, actually the heat pump is now a little bit cheaper. In terms of carbon emissions, and we're just talking about one boiler, so these are whole building loads, by the way. So this one boiler in a whole building was able to affect the carbon emissions of the whole building. But we can see that in 2021, the heat pump just snuck past the boiler, but now it's gaining ground. It's going much further in 2022. So I'm saving carbon. So the big question, the disconnect, is the CapEx. Massively cheaper to put my boiler in than my heat pump. And what I did is I did a life cycle cost study over 20 years using 2021 costs and 2022 costs. Again, the boiler, much cheaper, but actually over 20 years, they're pretty similar. So what we're seeing is a repositioning of the business case between the economics and carbonomics. And if the price of gas continues to increase faster than the price of electricity, then you'll see this business case realign itself. Now that's just the boiler. If we talk about entire systems, then we're talking a lot of money and be quite a powerful case to decarbonise buildings. So I haven't done the 20-year life cycle study on this because it takes ages, to be honest. It's easy to do it for a boiler and a heat pump, but when you're looking at whole building systems, it's another question. But this is a much larger building where we looked at something called a four-pipe fan coil unit, which uses gas as opposed to an air source heat pump system. Excuse me. And we can see straight away the air source heat pump system is cheaper, emits less carbon, significantly less carbon in 2022, but there's a disconnect. It's still much cheaper to do this. However, I might not be able to rent that building, so I've now got a problem. If I present my clients with these figures, they're going to have a heart attack. So what we've developed is this view here. So we're trying to give them better Now, to go back on myself very quickly, to continue to maintain and continue to replace the four-pipe fan coil unit, a business as usual scenario, we would be able to recover most of those costs in something called a planned maintenance report. So we would prepare a budget, if you like, for the next 10 years, it's normally 10 years, to say in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, you ought to expect these costs. And oops, in year 7, you're going to have a lot of costs because those fan coil units, they're pretty old. We're going to have to replace them. The boiler's had it. We're going to line all these costs up. But I know I might not be able to rent that building. I also know that if I want to reduce energy, as I showed you in the previous slide, and if I want to reduce carbon, I'm going to have to do something different. So we came up with something called an alternative PMR. And the difference between the two is I can recover possibly 100% of my costs there through service charges, but I might not be able to cover all of my costs there because we've got improvements. And in the rules and regulations around service charge recovery and in something called dilapidations, I can't recover improvements. But what that's given me is the true cost of repositioning my asset. So I'm now saying to my client, no, you don't have to spend nearly £4 million. You've got to spend this sum here, which is £865,000. And if you look at that on its own as an investment, the energy savings are almost on balance in 10 years, and they're much more profitable over 20 years. So because ultimately the investment is in the building, not necessarily in the HVAC. They need to continue to let the building. They might get more rent for having a building. So this is only part of the picture, but we're saying you can recover this difference in cost because I'm giving you this information now. But in terms of the risk to value, if they wanted to sell their building to an informed purchaser, actually the element that you can't recover are the improvements. So we've also quantified the improvements, which is obviously a much bigger sum. It's still a high sum. In this case, it's nearly £2 million, but £2 million is a lot better than nearly £4 million. So we've contextualised this information, and it's been very helpful. The RICS have just effective January 2022, released a guidance note on how to account for sustainability in valuation, and we've aligned what we do with that note. And that's just a sort of larger view of it, but these slides will be circulated. How much time have I got?
You're okay. Yeah.
So I've talked a lot about EPCs, and it's quite hard to visualise them. So I was going to quickly try and show you what an EPC looks like. So this could go terribly wrong, but I'll just make this small, get rid of that. Can we see my screen? I think that's possible. Sorry? I've changed it on here, but it's not showing on there. No worries. I think this one might not work then, but the point of this demonstration was to really allow, it's very easy when we talk about EPCs, because what you essentially see at the other end is something you could put on a fridge, sort of A to G bar rating, and what perhaps is not fully understand is what sits behind that fridge magnet, and how you can continue to use that for asset management purposes. I think that's the point. We're just trying to sort it out. So I was going to show an example of a real life project that I did not so long ago. Is there any? We've got. Perfect. There we go. Hurrah! So yeah, this is a model that is used to generate an EPC, and I'm just going to change my glasses because I can't get on with bifocals. So this is a real project. This is a command centre, the fire, ambulance and police, somewhere in the UK. I probably shouldn't say where, but so it's just a wire frame at this stage. And what we do is we build a 3D replication of the building. You can have a look around it. We can do all sorts. We can make the sun go round so I can see when my shade goes on. I can do lots of really interesting things. And I can also generate an EPC. And as you can see, I can work in New Zealand, I can work in Singapore, I can work in Canada. ASHRAE, that means I can do anything that's sort of American. There's different schemes across Europe that would use ASHRAE calculations. I can now work in Europe, all from this model that I've built to generate an EPC. And there's huge amounts of data that sit in these models. So I'll just sort of give you a quick sort of idea of some of it. So I mean, there's thousands of data points. This building has chilled beams. It tells me all sorts of information. So when we talk about an EPC, I'm talking about potentially about a digital twin of your building. It can tell me a lot of information. It can even tell me if the occupants are likely to be happy or unhappy. So I'll just go into here. Sorry, there we go. People gain, solar gain. I'm trying to find my occupant dissatisfaction survey. There's so many, well, what you can tell for this is so many metrics I can choose for. I can't actually find what I'm looking for. So I can generally use this model to inform not just my asset risks, but my operational performance. And not just my operational performance in terms of energy and in terms of carbon, but in terms of the propensity of your occupiers to be satisfied with their environment. And we can even take live data and populate these models with CSV data to calibrate it so we can make better informed decisions. So that demo didn't go quite as I had imagined, but hopefully it gives you an idea as to what sits behind an EPC. And to go back to my original point about something called SBEM v DSM, what I've just shown you now I couldn't do in SBEM, but I can do in DSM. So if you've got a reasonable sized asset or assets, it's probably worth spending a little bit more money to get your DSM so that you can use it for more than just an EPC. I think that's the end of my talk. So thank you.
Okay. I'm going to pick up a microphone just in case there's any questions from the floor to begin with, and then we're going to come back to those online in a minute and take questions from those that are watching at home. So if you're at home and you've just watched Andrew's presentation and you'd like to ask Andrew a question, please, at the bottom of the screen you can see a question box. If you type it in there, and then I will read the question out for Andrew to answer if you're at home. And if you're here, has anyone got any questions for Andrew about all of that? It's quite a lot to take in. Yeah, I'm just checking that's on. Yeah, if I can just ask you to hold that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very good. Just a small question relating to performance gap analysis from design to as-built. I know in residential design there's a big gap, up to 400% between what's designed and what's actually being delivered. Is that something that can be evaluated?
Yeah, absolutely. So the performance gap is partly down to a misunderstanding as to what people are looking at, and partly down to a lack of skills, I guess, in the industry, and a lack of momentum for various reasons. But when we look at an EPC, or when we look at what we call a BRUCL certificate, which is the Building Regulations UK Part L, so that's the requirement to demonstrate that the building you are about to construct is going to be energy efficient, we only see what we call regulated energy loads. So that's loads associated with heating, ventilation, air conditioning, lighting, domestic hot water. I think I've got them all. But that excludes, in some buildings, 50-60% of the load. It excludes loads from plug-in loads, computers, vending machines, external lighting, lifts, all sorts of loads. So firstly, the starting point is frequently misunderstood about what you're looking at, which is why you have these huge 400% gaps. So ideally what you would do is you would have a more holistic view. You'd use the DSM that I've just showed you, and you would come out of the compliance mode that people use, and you would undertake a different methodology, which is a methodology supported by neighbours, but also by other documents. There's something called CIBSE, the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers. They've got something called TM54, I'm sorry. And that would give you a methodology for calculating a more accurate representation of what the building would use. The reality is not many people necessarily want to pay for it, so it's always down to money. But the performance gap exists because of that. People not necessarily understanding what they're looking at and not really running proper models to understand exactly what the building is going to do.
Just an added question. Are you seeing more post-construction audits? Proof testing? Yeah,
no, I'm POE. So certainly for the much larger assets, typically owned by or developed by funds, or the big development companies, POE is an important part of that. If you're going for a rating scheme, a BREEAM rating, POE would get you some extra points, some credit. So not enough, but it certainly is getting better.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the floor? Yeah.
Question. I'm Paul Shipson. We're both, Suzanne and myself, are from a company that help construction companies with management systems around environmental management. So it's really interesting, this kind of aspect, because one of the questions that we get asked a lot, or some of the ideals, is about how they can improve their environmental approach to clients and improve their overall kind of stance and win more work that way. So I'm just understanding where you are fitting in. Do you provide services to architects or construction companies or sort of landlords, or all three?
Anyone who will pay me.
Yeah. Do you find your client base is more towards landlords wanting to engage construction companies?
So I say 80% of our work is in existing buildings.
Right.
So we typically have two types of clients in that arena. We have the fund will either appoint us directly, and that represents 50-60% of our business. We work for very large funds, but also asset managers who are appointed by the fund will come to us to say, actually, this is a bit technical or a bit complicated, can you help us with us? So we would help them with those. We will get involved in optimising the operation of the building, but also when they come to refurbish it under what we call different types of fit out, category A plus, B, you'll be aware. So we would use the model to predict what might happen if they were to go for system A or system B, or lamp A or lamp B. And then the 20% of our business is new development. So we would, this was a new development. So again, we would do the BREEAM calculations, the Part L calculations, heat networks. We're quite active in heat networks. We've got a big project on at the moment. So it's about an 80-20 split.
Okay, thanks, that's useful.
Any other questions from the floor? I've got a question, Andrew. I don't need the microphone. I was just going to ask you, what do you see, what are your headlines? If you were going to have some headlines, say 1 or 2 points that you wanted everyone to pay attention to in your world, what would they be?
Don't wait until 2030. So it might seem like it's a while away, but actually start start planning now, and with correct planning and with the right information, it might not be as expensive as you think. Because if you just ask someone to tell you how much it costs to reposition a building, you might be in for a bit of a shock. But if you understand actually how that cost slots into the wider picture around cost recovery, you can find a way to manage it. Also, important to remember, if you make buildings energy efficient, you save energy, and energy's got a value. So how can you use that value? There are examples, I'm sure they won't mind me name dropping, but I think British Land are a good example of this, where I think they were quite innovative in terms of their service charge arrangements for their headquarters in London, where they're very, they engaged with their occupiers and said, you know what, we want to carry out improvements. We understand that probably, you could argue that we shouldn't recover those, but here's the benefit. We're going to save some energy, we're going to reduce the service charge bills, and we're going to save some carbon. So, it is an opportunity as well as a risk.
I've got another question for you. How well understood do you think these new legislation requirements are understood by the industry? Because you've shared a lot of new information about new things and lots of changes that are coming through. Do you think that's filtered through to the market yet? Do they understand this?
I suppose I live in a slightly closeted world because we deal with these huge funds or big surveying practices, household names almost. So I would be worried if they didn't understand it, because that would be almost negligence. But I guess most people are probably aware of it, but whether they've got to grips with what they have to do to begin to tackle it, that varies, I think, between the private sector and the public sector. Even in the private sector, between the type of landlord. So again, if you're a fund landlord, you've probably got a strategy. I would hope you do, because they have the resources. I suppose it's down to resources, isn't it? But maybe in the public sector, they're 1 or 2 years behind.
Okay, so in terms of the opportunities in the market in Shropshire, because we're talking about quite a rural county, and I guess a lot of this is already happening in the cities more, perhaps London. Do you see an opportunity to share, to bring some of that best practice to a rural area?
Definitely. So we're talking to Shropshire Council to see what we can do to help. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter if it's London or Shrewsbury, the regulations.
Yeah.
So your building in Shrewsbury is just as unlettable potentially as your building in London. So I don't really think it's a sort of city v town or rural issue. I think some of the challenges around decarbonisation will be different. So I guess there'll be many assets in a county such as Shropshire. They're not on the gas grid, but if you just talked about gas, it's maybe going to be phased out anyway, but you might be using oil. But fundamentally, the requirement to meet net zero carbon is law. We've got to do it by 2050 based on the government's definition of that. So it will affect Shropshire as much as anyone else.
I have got one question from wherever they are, online for you. So the question is it worth having a DSM model on every single building? If so, what's the difference in cost?
No, it's not worth having it on every single building. So if I had a simple shop, I probably wouldn't bother on that. But if I had a large building, an office, even maybe a large industrial unit, possibly, I'd have it on that. Well, I would have it on that. And how much does it cost? Well, to be honest, I wouldn't charge you any more or any less from a DSM to an SPM, because I can produce them roughly personally in the same amount of time. I just don't want to use SPM. But that's a business choice for this business, because as a surveyor, I'm a former surveyor, and I'm an engineer, and I'm a chartered energy manager. I want to use the models to answer questions and to be useful, and I can't do a lot of things in SPM that I can do in DSM. But no, you don't need to get DSM on everything, would be my short answer.
Okay, well that's all the questions I've got from people online. So if there's no more questions from the floor, we're going to wrap it up there.